You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon from Washington, D.C. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and delighted to have you with us whatever time you're joining us and from wherever you're joining us, because I know many folks are joining both via YouTube as well as live stream and, of course, on the Zoom link. Welcome to this program on coronavirus, China, and the courting of Southeast Asia. As we go into the second year of the global pandemic, issues relating to the pandemic, issues relating to China's role in the pandemic, and of course the impact on Southeast Asia all fused together in very complicated ways. And fortunately, we have two outstanding speakers today to try to make sense of some of these strands and threads. We have Benjamin Ho, Dr. Benjamin Ho, who's currently a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. On a regular basis, he is an assistant professor in the China program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And as you can see from his bio that has been distributed, he has a number of important publications, including most recently for the U.S. National Defense University's PRISM magazine on China. So welcome, Benjamin. Thank you for taking time during your Fulbright visiting scholarship here in Washington to join us for this program and offer some views from the region as well as views you've taken away during your research here. Our discussant today is Sebastian Strangio, who is Southeast Asia editor at The Diplomat. Many of you will know his most recent book, amongst others, In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century from Yale, but he's also written on Hun Sen's Cambodia and in numerous publications as a journalist. And we're delighted to have Sebastian join us from Australia. His expertise, too, is, of course, well known in this area of China, Southeast Asia. So welcome. I think Benjamin is going to lead us through a brief PowerPoint for about 20 minutes, and then we'll invite Sebastian to make some comments as he wishes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the floor and additional discussion. Welcome. Benjamin, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Satu. Could I just check that my slides are visible?
They are to me.
Okay, excellent. Good afternoon to everybody. And for some of our friends who are in Asia, good morning to you. My name is Benjamin, and I'm happy to be able to present some of my, well, I would say more reflections rather than, this is probably not one of those deep, big academic papers as what we're talking earlier. So it's not an academic seminar per se. I have to clarify there is no methodology involved in my presentation. These are mostly reflections, observations from where I am. Spent the last couple of years in Singapore, ever since the start of the coronavirus, as well as the last 3 months in the United States at the Elliott School. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to sort of try and relate some of these developments with regards to coronavirus, the Chinese challenge, and more importantly, and I think what it means to Southeast Asia. So this is going to be my broad outline of what I'm going to talk about today. As Satu mentioned earlier, this part of this presentation is an extension of my earlier manuscript paper that I wrote in the PRISM journal from the National Defense University. So if you would like a more detailed explication of some of the ideas, you could check out the manuscript. I believe it's published last year. This is the outline. I'm going to talk about the geopolitics of the coronavirus, and I'll go on to highlight 5 Chinese strategic objectives, which were actually discussed in the manuscript in the PRISM journal. And I'm trying to relate it to Southeast Asia, what it means in terms of the courting of Southeast Asia. And finally, I'll conclude with some remarks. So let's just briefly talk about this geopolitics of the coronavirus. As we all know, it's not just a health pandemic. There is certainly a geopolitical dimension to it. And at least from events of the last couple of years, I just want to sort of frame our understanding of this geopolitics of the coronavirus, in particular in reference to SinoUS great power competition. So it's very interesting to note that in 1st October 2019, and that seems like a long time ago, if you are still able to sort of date where we are. This is just 2 years ago, but it seems like a really long time ago. The People's Republic of China celebrated its 70th birthday. And it's interesting because if you still recall what were the events around that period, we had Brexit talks in the UK. Wow, that seems like an eternity ago. You had problems, you had political opposition to then President Donald Trump in the United States, and also ongoing social protests in Hong Kong. So it was a very sort of chaotic world or situate period we were living. We thought things were going to get better, but we never knew that the coronavirus pandemic has sort of made things even worse. But one key message, and if you look at China's 70th birthday, it would seem that the key narrative that was being sold by the Chinese government was that a powerful and prosperous China celebrates its international success, while many Western societies had their own domestic problems. Of course, fast forward today, more than 400 million cases and 5.76 million deaths. We've seen the coronavirus pandemic reshape the global geopolitical theater. But one observation I've made, at least in the last 2 years, is that how China is responding to the coronavirus pandemic seems to suggest that it wants to demonstrate that its brand of governance is superior to that of the West, and consequently, it deserves a greater say in and political influence over international affairs. In my paper, I talk about it is likely that what we're going to see in the course of a post-pandemic reality is that we will see a greater hardening of Beijing's resolve to pursue its national interests. And we have also seen a siege mentality among Chinese leaders. And we're all very familiar with the idea of wolf warrior diplomacy over the last couple of years. And what is the significance of the pandemic? And I would just like to highlight the fact that this is the first truly global crisis China had faced under presidency. I mean, you had domestic problems here and there, but this is really the first truly global crisis. And well, the fact that the coronavirus pandemic emerged from China really put the spotlight on China internationally. And it's really a test of the CCP's mettle, political legitimacy, as well as the second point is the worsening Sino-US relations. The pandemic came in the worst possible time. So to quote something from the movie Interstellar, whatever can happen will happen, and it really happened at the worst possible time. So this is the sort of the backdrop to where I'm trying to sort of frame my discussion. So some key questions that informs my discussion. Firstly, will China's strategic objectives evince greater change or continuity with the past? How will the pandemic and worsening relations with the US affect China's foreign policy calculations and more broadly its role and place in the world? And the third point is what kind of changes will we see within China even as the CCP continues to insist that its brand of governance remains superior to Western liberal democracy? So I will discuss 5 strategic objectives under presidency, but I just want to sort of put forth my central argument up front, is that Chinese government views its model of liberalism abroad and illiberalism at home as a means of success to world politics. And we can certainly discuss this. So this is my central argument that I would like to preface the rest of my presentation in. So 5 strategic objectives under presidency. Some of these may not be unfamiliar. I'm sure many of us are familiar with it, but I thought I would like to relate some of these objectives to the coronavirus pandemic and what that tells us about Chinese thinking. So these are the 5, and I argue that the CCP has used the coronavirus pandemic to press its advantage in all 5 areas, at least in the first 24 months of the crisis up till the Omicron surge. And we'll discuss maybe perhaps towards the end a bit about what the Omicron surge means for the Chinese government, given that it seems very reluctant to open up. So the first point, I think all of us probably know, is to ensure CCP legitimacy. What's interesting in some of the research over that period is that US-China trade war, if you still recall, that trade war, which is still ongoing, but clearly it's been a bit more quiet these days, it has generated support for Trumpian policies amidst many Chinese liberal intellectuals. So that's something to note. There is an article in the Journal of Contemporary China that argues that there are actually a growing chorus of opposition to President Xi, given the fear of the fact, given the fear of the party state totalitarianism. So many Chinese liberals actually quietly sort of explore alternatives, and one might even argue that there is support for President Trump's policies among many Chinese liberal intellectuals. Of course, we are aware, of course, that right now it doesn't seem to be the case, but in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, it also resulted in considerable discontent towards the CCP. So for those of us who have been exploring Chinese social media in the early days, this was very clear, especially President Xi's conspicuous absence from ground zero in Wuhan. One of the articles, it was reported that it was said that Xi has not visited places hard hit by the virus, and that sort of created some kind of challenge and even questioning with regards to his leadership. Where is President Xi? And of course, for our friends in the United States, we're all very familiar with this piece published by a Chinese CPC professor, Cai Xia, who makes the explicit argument about the failures of the Chinese Communist Party. So it really highlights the very brutal but brittle character of Chinese politics. And it also demonstrates that part of the main storyline that the Chinese government was trying to push forward is really to ensure its legitimacy, given the problems it had in the early days of the pandemic. The second point is to widening its international support base. Many of us, again, are very familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, so I don't need to talk about it, except to note that Chinese statecraft has always been about widening its international support base. And economic measures, if you look at the Belt and Road, it is particularly useful in helping states to gain political influence for various reasons. What we saw in the coronavirus pandemic, and this is a graph I pulled off from one of these websites which tracks Chinese vaccines. It's very interesting to note that the vaccines that China has donated primarily occurs in the global south. So from Africa to South America and parts of Eastern Europe, and also in Southeast Asia, which we will talk about later on. So really, we saw that China's mask and vaccine diplomacy, particularly in the developing world, was giving China this opportunity to try and widen its international support base. And you realize there was, among developing countries, there was almost no criticism, at least explicitly and publicly, about the origins of the coronavirus, which is quite unlike what we saw in the West, especially in the United States. Whatever the real reasons, whatever the true origins might be, it is clear that within the global South, there was very little criticism of China. So clearly, there was some kind of diplomatic, China was very aggressive in pushing out masks, in pushing out vaccines to the developing world. The third point, and this relates to the problem of Taiwan, and I'm sure this is something that some of us may ask. So how do we see that being fleshed out during the coronavirus pandemic? If you just look at the number of diplomatic relations that Taiwan had in the last 8-9 years, in 2013, it had relations with 22 countries. As of today, it's just 14. And scholars would argue that this is an ongoing diplomatic tug of war, which features both the PRC and the ROC in a tussle for recognition as the representative state of China in international society. So during the coronavirus pandemic, we are all familiar that Taiwan was probably the first entity to close its borders to China. I think in end December, it closed borders to China. And subsequently, in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, there was almost a sort of competition between both Beijing and Taipei to demonstrate who could do a better job. We are all very familiar that even right up till now, Taiwan has not opened its borders, and I suggest it reflects an ongoing contest between Taipei and Beijing over keeping the pandemic in check within their respective borders. Hence, this ongoing zero COVID strategy, or now the Chinese government call it dynamic zero, but zero is zero literally. So whatever the case is, it's very clear that it's an ongoing competition about who could actually protect its borders better. Of course, we know that China stonewalled Taiwan's bid to participate in the WHO, not allowing the Taiwanese to share their experiences with the international community. So from all this, what I argue is that diplomatic efforts made by the Chinese government to showcase its contributions overseas. And again, we saw both the Chinese government and the Taiwanese government both also donating masks. So Singapore was also a recipient of some of these mask diplomacy. And it is a reflection of the attempt by the CCP to reframe the domestic narrative of the outbreak and to emphasize that we are able to protect our citizens, no matter where you are, better than other countries. So if you look at Chinese mask diplomacy, a lot of the public comments, public diplomacy was actually in trying to reassure not so much citizens of other countries, but Chinese citizens, overseas Chinese citizens in those countries that the Chinese government has your back. And it's a case of, by doing that, one could also argue that the Chinese government is trying, in a sense, to put one over Taipei in terms of its mass diplomacy, in terms of protecting its citizens. The fourth point, and this really pertains mostly to Sino-US relations in East Asia. Scholars like Aaron Friedberg have made the argument that the ultimate aim of Chinese policymakers is to win without fighting and to displace the US as the leading power in Asia while avoiding direct confrontation. Just a couple of years ago, the China Defense White Paper also pushed forth the idea that the US essentially is China's enemy number one. I mean, it's quite evident from the Defense White Paper. And I would argue that China perceives a post-COVID-19 world as one which will witness a shift in international power away from the West and consequently from the United States to Asia. So this logic of a shift in international power is not something new per se. Many scholars have sort of made similar arguments that the shift in terms of the weight of geopolitical influence will be moving from the West to Asia. But what China is also trying to do is to tag along not just the shift of balance of power from the West to Asia, but the fact that the shift in terms of leadership will move from the United States to, well, in this case, China, and in which China is well placed to assume a prominent position. So these two are intrinsically linked, from the West to Asia, from the United States to China. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but this seems to be the narrative that many Chinese scholars, public intellectuals seem to put out. And by that, leaders and policymakers should be prepared to confront a new international reality whereby American primacy is substantially diminished and China's influence increased. Well, I've got to put in a caveat. Some of these discussions were also written during the latter years of the Trump administration. So clearly, Biden would seem to have been making adjustments to US Indo-Pacific strategy, and it would seem that the United States have sort of tried and re-emphasized its presence in the region. But be that as it may, I would argue that China very much sees this shift in terms of geopolitical power as something almost inevitable. And the coronavirus pandemic, given the fact that the United States suffered really much more than many countries around the world, sorts of validates that initial hypothesis. And my last point about this section is that it's also about the global rules and international order. China sees itself as a flag bearer of a new alternative system, one that is not linked to the liberal international order, or at least one that is not overly being controlled or shaped by rules of the liberal international order, which is, well, incidentally part of what I'm actually doing in my Fulbright in the United States. And greater efforts really by China to shape international discourse about the rules of international order. And what I will argue, again, is that China seeks to affiliate itself with patterns of international liberalism while retaining an illiberal edge to its domestic governments. That's really the central argument that I would like to highlight in this presentation. And how do we see that? It frequently highlights the failings of the US and the West in their coronavirus response. as vindication that its political system is superior. And that's a very clear message we have seen from Beijing in the last 2 years, that look at the number of deaths, at the number of cases in the West. How could that reflect a superior model of governance? And I would argue there is some truth in that. I mean, if you look purely at the numbers, it would seem that China has done a better job. And this also reflects a certain scapegoating of the US as the source of all these problems. So how do we relate all this to Southeast Asia? I've talked broadly about 5 Chinese strategic objectives. What does this courting of Southeast Asia means? And more importantly, why Southeast Asia? Firstly, and for very obviously, it is China's backyard. Its geographical proximity from Beijing and distance away from the United States allow China to challenge America's primacy. I know that Sebastian Strangio here has written an excellent book on In the Dragon's Shadow, as well as other books by Where Great Powers Meet by David Shambo. So these books have provided very good mapping of Southeast Asia and its relationship with China. So I will not belabor this point, except to note that I think in the context of Southeast Asia, geography really matters. To use an example, being based in Washington, if you were to travel by plane, 6 hours later, you are in San Francisco on the West Coast. Whereas if you're in Southeast Asia, basically from Beijing, in 6 hours, you can get to every part in Asia. So it goes to show the level of extent in which China has the upper hand. If one recalls, Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a tremendous effort to travel to almost, well, many Southeast Asian countries. I did not take note of his flight itinerary, but clearly he traveled a lot in the first year. And really that gave China the advantage to sort of push forward its narrative, to push forward its position in terms of its geopolitical interests. A second point, and this is quite obvious again, that Southeast Asia countries, they're all small. Obviously, it's small is relative, but broadly speaking, in comparison to China, we're all small countries. And that really shows you the inherent advantage that China possesses over Southeast Asia, especially in terms of economic leverage, from infrastructure to tourism. So we saw in the case of many countries in Southeast Asia, when the Chinese tourists dried up, when no Chinese tourists could come in, a lot of countries had big problems in their tourism industry. So China clearly has an outsized advantage in terms of economic leverage. The third point, which is again something I'm pretty sure many of us in here will be familiar, Southeast Asia countries, for better or worse, are probably less caught up with values of human rights. Greater acceptance of Chinese political system, at least publicly, they don't sort of criticize the Chinese system. And of course, if we tie it back again to ASEAN's much vaunted rule of domestic non-interference, if it basically gives China a free rein to conduct its domestic politics without any worry that it would be criticized by ASEAN. So that's really a sort of a trump card for China, because it knows that no ASEAN country would criticize it for human rights issues. That's basically a free way. And linked to this is the fact that Southeast Asian countries are viewed as more pliable due to its neutrality principle. So the Chinese have taken advantage of this to sort of say that, well, you should not take sides. And therefore, because you are neutral, you should not take sides. Southeast Asian countries, in a sense, are more pliable. That will link me to a subsequent point I'll make in my conclusion. Again, the intramural divisions, again, we are aware of the limitations of Southeast Asia and ASEAN, makes Southeast Asia particularly susceptible to Chinese sort of divide and conquer strategy. The sixth point, which is something many of our Southeast Asian friends can probably identify with, is that the presence of ethnic Chinese gives Beijing the opportunity to use cultural elements to generate political affinity. I know we are almost out of time. Let me just go to my conclusion. So these are a couple of thoughts. Sense of crisis engendered within the CCP means that China would be even more paranoid and sensitive to external criticism. Chinese policymakers, at least in my reading, perceive a united Western front existing right now to undermine China's political system and constrain its rise, as seen by AUKUS, Quad, and Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is the point I was highlighting earlier. China will continue to extend its influence operations throughout Southeast Asia to turn those who are pro-West to neutral, those from neutral to pro-China, and from those pro-China to anti-Western. China's Achilles heel, however, would lie in the fact of its unattractiveness of its domestic models, as we have seen in some of these regional surveys that have been conducted. And the last point is that whether would China have to play catch up with the West in a post-pandemic global system, given that it has not quite opened up yet. So appreciation to all these institutions and people in aiding my research and providing me support in the last few years and few months. Thank you so much.
Benjamin, thank you so much indeed. That was a lot to get through in the amount of time we gave you, and deeply grateful. So a lot of things there for us to discuss. And with that, let me turn it over to our formal discussant. And then I do hope participants that you will submit questions in the Q&A and or via chat if you're watching live stream to take up the discussion with these two wonderful experts. Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks, Benjamin, for a very interesting presentation. I have just a few comments, really sort of maybe just expanding on some of the points that you made. But I mean, the first point that you made about the nature of the pandemic as a sort of referendum on China's political system, or a chance to showcase the achievements and superiority of China's political system. I mean, I think this really taps into anxieties and concerns that the Chinese leadership has had about the notion of Western universality, or a set of universal values that appeared to be an ascendant at the end of the Cold War. I think it's worth remembering that China's 3 decades of economic takeoff coincide almost perfectly with the post-Cold War unipolar era. So through from the early 1990s onwards, as China's economy begins to grow, and Chinese leaders slowly accumulate economic successes through these years, they're hearing this sort of message from the West that, you can't be politically illiberal and innovative. You can't have a free market or elements of a free market system alongside authoritarian politics. And sort of some of these ideological presuppositions of the early post-Cold War period are, I think that the Chinese leaders have always sort of in the back of their mind had this idea that, we'll show you, basically. And the COVID pandemic obviously provided a perfect opportunity for them to showcase the relative merits of the Chinese system versus the relative demerits of particularly the US system. And so I think that it's, but I think in a broader sense, it's less about promoting a Chinese model internationally than it is about undermining the idea that there is one universal model. So the Chinese white papers always talk about nations being able to take their own development paths. This is at least nominally an idea of sort of a pluralism of political systems with which China will engage without prejudice. And so, I think that, what this explains, and this comes to another point of yours, the appeal that China has, or China's approach to the global South, because obviously the global South is a region that, when it is looked at, the Western dominated sort of, or rules-based order, if you want to put it that way, it's been very ambivalent about that. When Western leaders were criticizing China for debt trap diplomacy, a lot of nations in Africa could quite realistically say, well, what about IMF structural adjustment programs and the burden of debt that many of us have had to bear from the World Bank and the IMF, through the years. So there is a sort of sense that in the parts of the world where China has really targeted its vaccine diplomacy, the sense of the superiority of the Western model has always been in question amongst certain constituencies, and there's always been a sort of ambivalence about that. And so the Chinese leadership is very reasonably focused on those regions of the world. I also think it's important to note that in many of these regions, there really was no alternative. To turn to Southeast Asia, for instance, Cambodia has one of the highest vaccination rates in Southeast Asia. The only option really open to the Cambodians was Chinese vaccines. Even if they'd not wanted Chinese vaccines out of concern about overdependence on China or concern about the efficacy of these vaccines, it is unlikely they would have been able to obtain sufficient supplies of the mRNA vaccines from the American manufacturers or the AstraZeneca from the UK. So, in many ways, these nations have relied on China's ability to scale up production to very high levels and to deliver large numbers of vaccines. And as a result, Cambodia has very widespread coverage and is actually, arguably punched far above its weight in terms of its COVID response. The same with Indonesia. I mean, this is a country that has to vaccinate 275 odd million people and has struggled to obtain the vaccines that it needs from Western sources. The Indonesian government and the foreign minister, Retno Marsudi, have been very vocal about the perils of global vaccine inequity and the need for there to be some way of delivering vaccines to the developing world and the global South that ensures the supply, that everyone gets the supply that they need. And of course, I think that there's, in Indonesia's case, taking Chinese vaccines was not really a political decision; it was simply a practical one. Really, as I said, there wasn't really another option. And so I think that, the pandemic in many ways has highlighted sort of some of the shortcomings of the Western dominated international system, which is, it has, the idea of sort of, there's been these Western pharmaceutical companies that develop these drugs, but they haven't been made the patents public. And, there's been a sort of vaccine nationalism that even despite all the calls, for leadership from the United States and other Western countries, and the US has done a lot for Southeast Asia, I must note that. The idea of sort of becoming the supplier of vaccines to the world, I think, is a real missed opportunity for the Biden administration. And I think that's offered the Chinese the ability to sort of insert themselves and say, we are the ones that really care about the global South and about supplying the world. And I think this also, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, this also taps into older traditions of sort of the anti-colonial, sort of anti-imperial heritage of the CCP and its championing of the global South. I mean, the Maoist version of the CCP was very closely engaged in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and presented itself as a champion of oppressed peoples worldwide. And so you sort of see an echo of that in the CCP's approach to the global South. And in terms of Southeast Asia, I mean, the only thing I'll add, I guess, is that, I see a certain continuity in the Chinese approach to Southeast Asia. I think that the message that we've had from Chinese diplomats and leaders over the past 2 years has really been one of just reinforcing this notion that China is an inevitable partner of Southeast Asia, that it's almost not even spoken, but there's just this assumption. It's just about reminding Southeast Asian governments that China is in the region, that China's economy, as China's economy recovers, Southeast Asian economies will recover too, and that the two are like so closely linked that any notion of sort of decoupling, which was a discussion that was very much in the air in the early months of the pandemic, is very unlikely at this point, just because of how much the region relies on China. And you mentioned tourism, Benjamin. I mean, China's zero COVID policies are preventing many Chinese tourists from visiting Southeast Asia. And for all the complaints about Southeast Asian tourists that you hear in many parts of Southeast Asia, I think that they will be welcomed back with open arms if and when they're able to travel to the region again. So it's really, I think, just about underlining this sense of geographic proximity, and in the sense that the region is in it together and is going to recover together. I mean, as you mentioned, Wang Yi visited, I think, every Southeast Asian nation in 2020, and except for Vietnam, but then he had, and then he paid visits to some of those countries again last year. I think it's just about sort of, reminding the region that, we're here, and we're not going anywhere. And the Americans are sort of, they're not in the region. And this is also reflected in the Chinese approach to the South China Sea, the idea of sort of outside countries interfering in what should be an intra-Asian sort of affair. And so, I mean, I think, I made the claim in my book that I think that the COVID pandemic will ultimately reinforce sort of the geographic advantage that China has. And I haven't seen anything so far that to sort of seriously challenge that idea. There's a long way to go still. And I think the final thing I'll mention is that for all of China's focus on Southeast Asia and its courting of Southeast Asia through COVID and vaccine diplomacy, I think this is not going to simply turn the region in China's favor. I think all of these sort of vulnerabilities and concerns that the region's governments have about China remain, will persist, and they'll continue to sort of introduce an element of tension into the relationships that they have with Beijing. And so, proximity, of course, is also a source of anxiety. You have anxieties about, over-dependence on China. You have anxieties about flows of Chinese workers and immigrants into regions of the Southeast Asia, where that has often been a sensitive issue. And you have sort of allegations of CCP, political meddling in various parts of the region as well. So I think all of these things, which of course are backgrounded by memories of the CCP's support for communism during the Cold War, and so I think there is sort of a sense in which the vaccine diplomacy is not necessarily going to work out in the way that the Chinese leadership hopes, and that Southeast Asia will continue to muddle through and try and maintain a balance between the economic giant that lives in their neighborhood and the other partners with which it has very close ties that are that lie further afield. I think I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to doing any Q&A if there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Sebastian. Terrific comments. I do want to give Benjamin the first right while there are 4 or 5 questions from the online streaming, as well as in the Q&A. And I do want to get to those to honor our participants. But Benjamin, you have a couple of minutes quickly to respond to anything specifically that you want to on Sebastian's comments before we are overtaken by participant Q&A.
Well, nothing controversial about Sebastian's comments. I think if you see me nodding my head most of the time, it's because I agree with most of them. Certainly, his comment on whether Southeast Asia, how does this vaccine diplomacy plays out in Southeast Asia. And I recall one of my friends from one of the neighboring countries just said that the best vaccine is the vaccine in your arm. So in a case that if you don't have a choice, then whatever vaccine that is presented to your country would be the most valid vaccine. And in a sense, the Chinese have done very well in sort of using some of these, I would say, structural limitations and constraints in Southeast Asia to sort of emphasize its presence. And I think this is another point that is often made, that for Southeast Asia, a lot of times showing up in meetings, literally FaceTime, it's everything. So in that sense, the Chinese diplomats have done a great job in basically using their air miles to visit various Southeast Asian capitals during in the first year of the pandemic. So that really gave China that advantage. But I would say right now that advantage might be overstated. Again, if I were to rewrite this article today, and given the Omicron surge and the fact that many countries are starting to live with COVID as an endemic, even countries in Southeast Asia, we saw the Philippines, Thailand, and even Malaysia all talking about opening up. So I think that's going to be a case where China might sort of, if it's not careful or if it keeps its borders closed for too long, it might find itself having to play catch up to countries in Southeast Asia and even the United States when it comes to projecting its influence. So I'll just stop at there. I thought we have got very good questions and would like those questions to be addressed instead.
Wonderful. Let's go to those questions, and I'm going to just go through them and ask you both to. We have approximately 18 minutes, so please be mindful, but we'll go through at least 5 or 6 that we can get to. First question, and they've given their names, so I assume it's okay to say their names. None have submitted anonymously. Christian Wells asks, will various methods of Chinese autocracy promotion increase in Southeast Asia in the post-COVID era, or will it remain committed to its pragmatic / non-interference approach? Is Chinese autocracy promotion exaggerated by the West? I guess Sebastian kind of addressed this in his vision. Wasn't so much that China seeks to have everyone adopt its model, but simply to articulate that there are other models. How do you guys assess that question? Why don't we start this time with Sebastian?
I mean, I think that certainly, China's critics in Southeast Asia are right that it's not helping by sort of supporting repressive governments and sort of dealing with them in this, without prejudice. It has, and selling them technology and arms and all of that. and engaging with them economically, it indirectly strengthens them. But I think, there's a couple of, we have to really be careful about our definitions here. I mean, if we're talking about autocracy, I mean, obviously Chinese support, Chinese leaders aren't demanding the release of political prisoners like the United States would. And so there are ways in which, this is, this is definitely detrimental to, the cause of democracy in many Southeast Asian countries. But I also think that ultimately, what political system exists in a country has a lot more to do with the social, political, cultural, and economic conditions in that particular country. I don't think that every country is necessarily a liberal democracy in waiting. There's sort of an assumption that if the Chinese weren't doing this, and if the Americans were, or if everybody was sort of engaging and insisting that countries behave more democratically, that we'd have a region of sort of flourishing liberal democracies. And I see a lot more challenges to that than, and so I think that, China around the edges has definitely made things worse. I don't see it. I think that it's been overrated in the US. I think there's the beneficent nature of American engagement has been overrated, both now and in the past. At the same time that the malignant impacts of Chinese engagement have been exaggerated. So I do think that there's, for people who are struggling for greater democratic freedoms, obviously, for a country like Thailand to have a partner in China that is willing to engage with it without any of those human rights preconditions, obviously is a huge advantage. But I ultimately think that, Thailand's, just to take it as an example again, its problems are, rooted in more complex issues to do with, vast inequalities of wealth and power within Thailand, sort of the sacralization of the monarchy and the military as its guardian, and the attempt by elites in Thailand to prevent the public from having a meaningful amount of sovereignty. I think, and I think that China sort of plays around the edges of that, but ultimately, it's we need to look within these countries for explanations of why their political systems are what they are. So yeah, I'll leave it there. But Benjamin, I don't know if you have any other follow-up thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just got a couple of quick comments on that. I would say it's, as Sebastian earlier mentioned, it's not a case where China is going out and trying to promote its system. But what we're seeing is really China trying to cultivate political elites, and it really focuses on the political elites, probably because it believes these elites are obviously ultimately the people who are going to make decisions. Nothing wrong with that, but I think what we need to recognize in terms of a comparative perspective is that, and this is where my talk on the rules-based order would probably touch on, is that the CCP views it much more narrowly compared to the West. So I would argue that China sees it in this way. What is good for the CCP is good for China. It doesn't really care too much about what the rest of the average Japanese or the average American or the average Thai person thinks. But in the United States worldview, it differs quite a bit, because what is good for the US is generally good for the world. So what is good for the US is generally good for the average Thai, the average Japanese, even the average Chinese. So I think in that fundamental differences in how these two countries view this whole issue of the idea of universalism and what is good for them and what is good for others. So I would say this becomes very problematic, especially when it comes to China relations with Southeast Asia, because ultimately what China is interested is how to cultivate political elites in these countries to make policies that are ultimately beneficial to China, and less so with regards to what happens in their domestic constituencies. I mean, one could make the same case in the US, but I would say, and even in my very limited time in the US, there is a slightly more broader consideration when it comes to making policies in the United States. I'll just leave it as that, and we could certainly further this conversation subsequently.
Thank you for that, both of you. Let me turn to the next question from Assistant Professor Anucha Chintakanond. And this is kind of I'm sorry, I skipped over Rikio Inoue's question. Forgive me, Professor, I'll come back to you. To what extent Inoue-san asked, to what extent do you think the vaccine diplomacy connections or distribution of vaccines will have a lasting impact on Chinese Southeast Asia? What aspects would make this more or less durable as an influence factor? And I just want to know, as you're well aware, both of you, the 21 ISIS survey ranked Japan as the biggest, highest trust partner in the region. US and China remarkably low. I forget the details, but was it around 20% favorability ratings or positive ratings? But China was #1 on the question of which dialogue partner helped most with COVID. Now, I admit that's 2021 survey, so it is outdated. But is this really long lasting? It struck me that we're talking about China coronavirus and et cetera in Southeast Asia, but there's a lot of countervailing stuff, as both of you have said, BRI, other activities by China, which would blunt that 44% approval rating. Thoughts? Benjamin, why don't you go first this time?
Yeah, just 2 quick response. One is that, well, only if the vaccine works. So I think that is something that right now there are also debate with regards to Chinese vaccines, whether they provide enough lasting protection. We've seen some Southeast Asia countries sort of explore other alternatives. So that's one thing to take a thing of. And second, the question as to, does China expect anything in return? So if it's sort of I give you vaccines, use it as wise as you can, and we're not going to expect anything, then yes, I would say that would have a lasting impact. But if some way down the road that exchange is a sort of a quid pro quo favor for something else, say building some bases or having additional sort of Chinese presence, then I think that vaccine diplomacy, that the success of vaccine diplomacy per se, it's basically going back to a case where, hey, we know why the Chinese are so generous. So I think it really is up to the Chinese not to make any demands upon these countries beyond what these countries are prepared to give. And only if they do that, can we talk about the success of its vaccine diplomacy.
Yeah, I think its vaccine diplomacy has been very much of a piece with its broader economic engagement. As I said, it's sort of about reinforcing the sort of economic interconnectedness and interdependence of the two regions. And yeah, I mean, I think that the Chinese have actually been relatively subtle in how they've gone about their vaccine diplomacy, in the sense that they haven't really, and a lot of observers in the West expected that they would make hard demands, de-recognize Taiwan in exchange for vaccines. In Southeast Asia, I haven't seen much of that. There was one instance, one report that a Chinese ambassador, I think, had asked for the release of a few Chinese fishermen that had been detained fishing in, I think, Malaysian waters, as a sort of quid pro quo. But other than that, I think they're pretty well aware that making these sorts of hard demands to nations in Southeast Asia that have concerns about China's growing influence and power would be a turnoff. And I think they're trying to depict themselves as sort of a friend to the region, and a friend in need is a friend indeed, right? That's sort of the kind of motto that's the propaganda line that's sort of underpinned the COVID engagement with the region. I think that efficacy will obviously play a role, but as with everything with the pandemic, we're still very far away from the end of this thing, and it's hard to see. We don't know what other variants are coming. We don't know what other Chinese vaccines might be in the works that might be, perhaps more effective and provide, much more direct competition with the Western alternatives in terms of efficacy. So yeah, there's a lot of water to go into the bridge, but I think that, it's about sort of reinforcing the pre-existing connections that have made Southeast Asian countries reluctant to sort of turn against China or join an anti-China coalition.
Well, thank you. Let us turn now to Professor Anucha's question. I am sorry for coming back to it a little later. First of all, if you accept the premise of this question, do you think the Western style of confrontation versus a softer diplomatic approach is an impediment to achieving more harmony, as it causes loss of dignity or face for China to submit to? I mean, there is a question there about whether U.S. approach, or Western approach in this case, is confrontational. in the first place? Many people in the region tell me that China's approach is quite confrontational or coercive, depending on where you are and where you sit in the region. Thoughts,
Yep.
Sebastian?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that potentially what the professor is getting at here is, I definitely think in the region there's, a sense, a distaste toward Western lecturing. I mean, that's certainly something you see everywhere, this sense that, the West knows best, and that, I think that you cannot underestimate in Southeast Asia the continued salience of the anti-colonial heritage, even in a place like Thailand that wasn't formally colonized. All of these things have left a very deep mark on Southeast Asian political cultures. Remember that this is the region that saw some of the most vocal exponents, the emergence of some of the most vocal exponents of the Asian values debate in the early 1990s. And I think that, the idea of a lot of American engagement and Western engagement, including the European Union with Southeast Asia, is sort of premised on this assumption that sort of our values and our system are self-evidently sort of the norm, and should be sort of the model for the region. And, when they criticize Southeast Asian governments over human rights issues and good governance and so forth, I mean, it does, I think it's sort of viewed as confrontational in a sense. And I think China's really leveraged this quite cleverly. But I don't necessarily agree. I mean, the Chinese have been very confrontational on sort of more in a more direct sense, like when a country is perceived to be stepping across the line of what China's core interests, whether it be the Philippines in the South China Sea or Vietnam in the same region. These nations have been subject to this is certainly not a harmonious approach to doing business, and as we've also seen with wolf warrior diplomacy. But I do think China is more, in terms of its views of other nations' political systems, it's much more tolerant and much more, there's a certain harmony and acceptance there for purely pragmatic reasons, of course. And I mean, I should also mention that this very pragmatic Chinese approach also has its downside, right? As we're seeing that right now in Myanmar, where the Chinese are sort of half-heartedly backing the military junta, partly because they feel that that's probably the only side in this struggle that can actually win. Whether they're right or wrong, I don't know. But it's generating a huge amount of mistrust and suspicion and hostility amongst the people in Myanmar. So there's certainly downsides to China's form of pragmatic engagements, that it finds itself tarred by association with, hated elites and governments in the region. So, but yeah, I mean, that's about all I have on that question.
Sure. Benjamin, anything on that question? Otherwise,
Yep.
we've got three more in the queue as well.
Yes, I just got a couple of comments. So this is where I differ slightly from Sebastian. I would say that this confrontation approach is, we need to understand it's not just about confrontation Western style per se, but it's about being explicit about the rules. And this is where I would say, if you work with Westerners, the rules are there, it's clear. Whereas in the case of Chinese, sometimes these rules are not stated. There is this Chinese saying, what is written is not done, and what is done is actually not written. So there's a lot of uncodified ambiguity in the Chinese style of working. And I would be, so I would say this confrontation, if it means being clear and explicit with the rules of engagement, then I think it's a good thing. But as we can see from discussions on the COC, the Chinese are not always very explicit about what they want. So this is the first point. The second point, and I think Sebastian talks about tolerance, the Chinese being tolerant of other models. To some extent, it is true, but I would say also the Chinese are tolerant of others, but they're not so tolerant when it comes to criticism of themselves. And this is something we see much less of in the West. I mean, over in the United States, you pretty much can sort of criticize someone else, criticize the government, because that's fair game. But in China, that's not the case. So I'll be careful about sort of painting this Western style confrontation as bad and the Chinese style as something more positive. I'll just leave it at that.
I'd agree.
Yeah, very interesting discussion. And of course, we could go on and on discussions like that. A couple of other questions. And again, we're at 2 minutes to, so I'm going to ask two questions here. I mean, let me see if I can kind of put a couple together. One is the question of how much the CCP is trying to strengthen relations with communist parties in the developing world. Used to be the case, but nowadays, one hears about Nepali communist. I don't see that many communist parties in the world. I know they have ties between the VCP and the CCP, but it certainly wouldn't be characterized as an overall close Chinese-Vietnamese relationship. Functional to be sure and pragmatic to be sure. So any thoughts on that? And the next question is, China, this is very interesting. China, here we are in the Olympics, is really trying a zero COVID policy, and Vietnam tried to adhere to it. But now that seems to be lifting a bit. So what's the important appeal of China's COVID policies now to Southeast Asia countries? No one seems to be, if anywhere, people in the US, as you see over the last week, Democratic and so-called blue states are lifting mandates on masks, even on infected people. Rightly or wrongly, I have no knowledge to know. I'm simply stating that that's a fact. And China is pursuing this very tough lockdown, zero COVID thing. Is that a model for others in the region now? Interesting question.
It is an interesting question. I do think it's probably too soon to say, really. I think that there's definitely, China's zero COVID policy is preventing a certain amount of economic interaction between the two regions, which I'm sure would be of concern to nations in the region, particularly in terms of tourism. And this might be a case where China's attempt to sort of prove the superiority of its system, to prove that, getting to zero is actually a sign of the pure brute state capacity of the CCP and the Chinese state. Might actually be detrimental, that it might prevent China from sort of re-engaging economically. We see the borders of Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam being, trade being slowed to a crawl due to these very laborious COVID checks that have been introduced. Fruit is being dumped by the roadside in Myanmar. The price of dragon fruits in Vietnam has dropped to mere pennies for the pound in Vietnam because, the trucks weren't able to cross the border into China. And so, this is just one sign of how, the COVID policy might be affecting the rest of the region. I think that we may see over time a sort of increased sort of friction between the two over this question. But as time goes by, you might see sort of this begin to affect the economic linkages that rely on this sort of, direct contact. But I think it still remains to be seen, because Southeast Asian nations are only now really beginning to kind of open up, regardless of the state of the COVID pandemic. I think Benjamin mentioned Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, just this month and next, sort of be opening their economies and opening up to tourism again. And I believe probably doing so for good now.
Should I make a couple of comments?
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, I would say any appeal is probably Southeast Asian countries are hoping that China would open up, because that's where the real appeal is. Not so much on the COVID zero, or now what the Chinese government calls dynamic zero. If you ask mathematicians, it's zero is zero. So I don't know whether it's sort of a indirect way of admitting that this COVID zero policy is non-sustainable without sort of losing face, because it earlier talked about COVID zero. So I would say Southeast Asia countries, we certainly would like China to sort of let the doors, let it open its borders, allow Chinese tourists to travel. So there is very little appeal of this China's post sort of zero COVID strategy. And one needs to also recognize the competition within Southeast Asia. So it's not just Southeast Asia and the world, but Southeast Asia states among themselves, they're also competing for tourists. So in that sense, you see all countries sort of talking about endemic in the last few months so quickly in that sense. So what one would view that, if one views the Chinese tourist dollar as a limited pie, then certainly we would obviously want that pie to be enlarged so that more and more countries would be able to recover from the pandemic.
Thank you, Benjamin and Sebastian. Let me go to the last question because we are at time, and I do want to recognize our colleague Jose Colazo, a longtime listener of EWC programs and participant. He asks about what's the current opinion on the Southeast Asian nations regarding China's BRI projects, especially in light of so-called, and he puts it in quotes, quote, debt trap diplomacy accusations. Where are we on this? The issue keeps coming up. People are picking stories here about this country or that country, this project or that project. Where are we? What you guys follow Southeast Asia daily? You follow China in the region daily. What's the kind of state of play on this issue? Sebastian, you want to start, and we'll give Benjamin the last word.
Sure.
As the presenter.
Well, I think in general, the region, people in the region tend to view, Chinese investments with a little bit more, objectively. I think that people who study the way that Chinese financing operates abroad have, I think, quite convincingly debunked the idea that there's sort of some purposeful debt trap that the Chinese government is setting for small developing nations. And I think that, Chinese infrastructure investment has been a very important part of the domestic agendas of President Duterte in the Philippines, President Jokowi in Indonesia, and others as well. That said, the debt trap diplomacy meme is something that has resonated through domestic politics in some Southeast Asian nations. When I was in Malaysia in late 2017, I heard from quite a number of people the concerns. The phrase debt trap diplomacy and references to the port in Sri Lanka were quite common amongst people who were critics of then Prime Minister Najib. Of course, Najib had taken on some very large Chinese BRI projects that it turned out were overvalued. So this reflected, I think, less sort of a nefarious Chinese plot than simply the venality and corruption of that current the Malaysian government of the time. In Cambodia as well, you see Chinese investments being referred to this way by the political opposition to Prime Minister Hun Sen and his party. But I think in general, I think to kind of maybe wrap up with a broader thought. I think that generally the way that U.S.-China competition has been depicted in the United States is sort of a struggle between one superpower that is essentially good and one superpower that is essentially bad. I think in Southeast Asia, the views of these two superpowers are much more gray and much more complex. So you tend to see, when it comes to Chinese investments, there are legitimate concerns about debt, as the case of Laos over the past couple of years has illustrated. But I also think that there is a sense in which the Chinese are capable of building quite impressive infrastructure and doing so relatively cheaply, and that and with relatively few little red tape. And so it is an attractive thing for many governments in the region. But that's not to say that there aren't controversies related to projects. There's controversies related to debt and debates about how much debt these nations should take on. Quite rightly, because debt can be a burden, even if it's not a purposeful debt trap. And there's also, I think, potentially a bigger issue in some countries is the possibility of Chinese workers coming in and taking jobs from locals. And this, brings up sort of, half-buried anxieties about, nations being swamped by Chinese immigrants and workers. And so, there are concerns, but they tend to be sort of slightly different from the concerns that you see expressed in Western capitals.
Right. I'll just add on a couple of comments. One, I think the bigger problem these days is that concerns within China itself, whether whether investments going outside of China are sort of good investments. So I think there are growing concerns that China is sort of this big signature BRI project has sort of led to a lot of unwise investments overseas, which are not making any dividends for Chinese companies. And so that is a debate going on within China. And I think another bigger question is also, if you look at recent events in property market in China isn't doing well. So there's a concern actually in Southeast Asian countries, not so much about that threat per se, about investments in their country, but about the money that is in China. Are we going to sort of see a lot of these big super companies sort of starting to realize to default on their ability to pay off these loans? So I think so I would say that this debt threat is if you view it just as a case of countries being trapped it's probably not the case because, as Sebastian mentioned, some countries in Southeast Asia are quite happy to welcome Chinese investments. But I think right now the bigger debate is within China about the sustainability of these investments and what happens to a slowing Chinese economy. My sensing is that the BRI will probably be played down in the coming years. I mean, we have not heard so much about the BRI, certainly not in the last 1 or 2 years, and I suspect this will be the case moving forward.
Well, thank you both. You have such remarkable expertise and writing and scholarship and journalism in the field experience. Really, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise with us. I know everyone online appreciates it very much. And as you know, many people will watch this recording in due course when we post the recording as well. So we'll get many viewers live, but we'll get many viewers subsequently. I just flagged before we say goodbye, 2 programs coming up next week, February 14th, North Korea and the Middle East, lessons learned from US-North Korea relations. A really terrific program trying to bridge how we can look at lessons learned from US-North Korea negotiations on nuclear issues and other issues. And then February 14th in the evening, speaking of Southeast Asia and the United States and China, Ambassador Tommy Koh and Mr. Daljit Singh's new co-edited book, which which they have put together on a Singapore perspective of America. And I am really looking forward to those folks, Ambassador Koh and Mr. Singh, because they have, of course, long years of experience watching America, dealing with America, and it'll be interesting with their co-authors. And that's February 14th in the evening, so we'll catch them in Singapore the next day. That's if you don't have Valentine's Day plans that evening. And on March 8th, again, Southeast Asia, but not the US or China, but a new book by our colleague at the University of Michigan, Associate Professor John Chiurkari, and that book is called The Courteous Power, Japan and Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific. And he will be joined by Professor Shino Watanabe of the Faculty of Global Studies at Sophia University, Tokyo. So again, we've got a lot of interesting program that sort of is in the thread of your guys' presentations and discussion today. I again thank you for taking the time to join us the next day in the morning, Sebastian, for you, and Benjamin, safe journey home to Singapore, and look forward to visiting you there. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Participants, thank you for joining us from the East-West Center. This is Satula May, over, and thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.